Hey, what's going on, guys? The next UFC pay-per-view is UFC 297, Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis. And I hate to say it, but UFC 297 is horrible. It is mediocre at best. And usually about a month out from a pay-per-view card, at least the last couple months, I've made videos saying, oh, UFC 294 is stacked. UFC 295 is stacked. Same on with 296. How crazy deep is UFC 296? And I was thinking, oh, I need to make a video like that for UFC 297, which is a little under a month away. Goes down January 20th in Canada. And I started looking at this main card. And I already knew the main card wasn't that great. But it is worse than I could have even imagined. It's worse than I remembered. And we're going to go through each fight on the card. I'm going to discuss each fight on the card. And honestly, without the main event, this isn't a pay-per-view worthy card at all. If there was an injury and the main event got canceled, this isn't even that good of a fight night, to be quite honest. That's how bad this card is. And the pay-per-view main card in general is a little wonky, to be quite honest. It's not even in the right order, but I guess the UFC sometimes does this, so I can't criticize the order all that much. But this is not a very good card. And it's not like I'm dying to see anything on this main card outside of the main event. Now, I will say there's at least one really solid prelim, which is Chris Curtis versus Marc-Andre Barriault. I'm looking forward to that. I feel like that should be on the main card. I understand why it's not, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And that's the only really great prelim. I'm not really, looking through these prelims, Malcolm Gordon, Jimmy Flick, none of these prelims jump off the page other than Chris Curtis versus Marc-Andre Barriault. So the prelims, it's not one of those cases where the bout order is so weird that, oh, the main card suffered a bit. This is one of those fight cards that's like, okay, obviously nobody wants to fight right after the holidays. Nobody wants to be in training camp during the holidays. So UFC 297 suffered. And if you remember, they kind of threw together Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis last minute. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but you could tell, they were really scrambling to find a main event for UFC 297. And there was talks of the vacant women's bantamweight title being the main event for 297 for a small period of time. There was talks of Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira too for a small period of time before they finally settled on Strickland versus Du Plessis, which I find quite ironic. And I do believe it was thrown together last minute because Strickland is a guy who has been notorious for his willingness to take short notice fights and his willingness to be super active. And I think that's how he ended up defending his middleweight title at UFC 297. Now, before I get into each fight, take a look at the entire main card. I'll show you the entire main card in advance. And if we look at the main card opener, this is probably the second best fight on the card, if I'm being honest. We have Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev. This is a really solid featherweight fight. To be honest, this should be like a main card opener, in my opinion. But the reason I kind of disagree with this placement on the card is because I think this is the second best fight on the card. I'm looking at the rest of the card, which we're going to go through in a minute, and I don't see a fight outside of the main event that's better than Movsar Evloev versus Arnold Allen. Arnold Allen has looked really good. He's coming off a loss against Max Holloway, but there's no shame in having a loss to Max Holloway. And it was a competitive fight, even though he clearly lost. Before that, a win over Calvin Kattar. Before that, an utter destruction of Dan Hooker. Before that, a win over Sadiq Youssef. So not the strongest resume, but Arnold Allen's one of those guys that has been considered like coming up to a contender and now has really been considered in title contention. And to be honest, if Alexander Volkanovski beats Ilia Topuria at UFC 298 in February, the next contender is probably going to be Arnold Allen or Movsar Evloev, because you look at Movsar Evloev, undefeated, 17-0. Coming in again, with a win over Diego Lopez. Look what he has done since then. Just got a, nasty win over Pat Sabatini, win over Dan Ige, win over Hakeem Dawodu, win over Nick Lentz. And while this isn't the best level of competition, he's had a fight booked with Bryce Mitchell that has fallen out. A while ago, he had a fight booked with Ilia Topuria. I would have loved to have seen that at one point in time. That was before either one of them were really title contenders. But if Movsar Evloev goes out there and beats a top-ranked Arnold Allen, I think he's right up there in title contention, if not getting the next title shot, because Volkanovski, if he beats Topuria, has kind of cleaned out the division. So I love this fight. I think skill for skill, both guys are some of the elite in the featherweight weight class. And I really don't have any complaints about this fight outside of, based on the current card, unless they add something to it, which we're like 3 weeks away, a little over 3 weeks away. I mean, this should be the featured fight on the card. If not, I mean, I know it can't be the co-main event because 2 title fights, but honestly, it's the second best fight on the card, no doubt. Okay, moving up on the card, we have Dominic Reyes versus Carlos Ulberg. Whoever match made this fight, I don't know if it was the new guy they hired or if it was Mick Maynard or, whoever else it may be, Hunter Campbell, whoever, Dana White, I don't know. Whoever made this matchup is going straight to hell. Dominic Reyes is a dead body. He's lost his last 4 fights. His last 3 he's been stopped in. He got finished by Ryan Spann by a jab. Fight before that, got laid out cold with a spinning elbow against Yuri Prochazka. Fight before that, got just outclassed by Jan Blachowicz, and his body was just abused by Jan Blachowicz. And now they're putting him against Carlos Ulberg, who's looked pretty good but hasn't fought the best level of competition, who is on a 5-fight winning streak, who's finished his last 4 opponents, and has looked pretty good doing it, but against lower level competition. And basically what they're doing is they're trying to build a fresh contender in the light heavyweight division in Carlos Ulberg from City Kickboxing. And they're like, you know what? What's a good way to kind of ease him into the rankings? Let's give him the dead body of Dom Reyes. If I'm not mistaken, I think Ulberg called out Reyes, which is completely embarrassing. Imagine calling out Reyes at this point in his career. And it's sad. Honestly, it's really sad to see the fall of Dominic Reyes because it's not like he's crazy old. He's 34 years old. That's not that old, especially for the light heavyweight weight class. But I think Dominic Reyes is a cautionary tale of the old Uncle Rico story where he got too hung up on the fact that I should have been the champion. I beat John Jones. And now he loses to Jan Blachowicz. He loses to Yuri Prochazka. He loses to Ryan Spann. And the Ryan Spann loss, I really feel like sealed Dominic Reyes' fate because Ryan Spann's not that good. And now basically they're using Dominic Reyes as a way to prop up future contenders in Carlos Ulberg. He's a stepping stone. That's all he is. And this is an easy path to kind of contendership for Carlos Ulberg. And I don't like this fight at all. Ulberg, he hasn't been fighting the best competition. Da Ung Jung, Iho Potieria, Nikolai Negamorianu, Tafan Nchukwi. Not the greatest competition, but okay wins. And he was doing it. He was winning very impressively. I wanted to see him get a step up. I would have liked to see him fight a legit contender. Not a guy who is on life support. His UFC career shouldn't even exist right now. 4 losses in a row, and his last 3 have been absolute brutal beatdowns and finishes. I hate this matchup. I don't think it's main card worthy, and I understand what the UFC is trying to do. They're trying to build a contender, but I don't like this fight at all. Don't care for this fight at all, and really, it belongs buried on the prelims somewhere. And sometimes Carlos Ulberg, I think it was in the Fabio Charant fight, I think I might have pronounced his last name wrong. I don't remember how you pronounce it. That was an absolute snoozer. But in this fight, I don't know how he doesn't finish Dominic Reyes. If you want an early prediction, Dominic Reyes' chin is gone. I mean, Dominic Reyes is one brutal finish away from Tony Ferguson territory. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. I just want to stress how bad this matchup is. And even if Ulberg wins and he wins in impressive fashion, what does it really tell us? It doesn't really tell us much because Dom Reyes is just going out there and getting finished every single fight anyway. So we don't even know that much more about Ulberg. And Ulberg, if he gets finished by Reyes by some chance, let's say Reyes has a career resurgence moment against a guy like Ulberg, Ulberg's career's over. I'll throw the dirt on myself at that point. I'll tap dance on his grave if he loses to Reyes because of where Reyes is currently in his career. So I hate this fight, and I really don't, it doesn't really interest me all that much. Okay, moving on to the featured fight on the card, Neil Magny versus Mike Malott. I get it. Here's another case of I understand why it's on the main card, but we're really putting Neil Magny on pay-per-view main cards in 2024. And, Mike Malott, he is a kind of a surging contender, and what's crazy is I thought he was much younger than he actually is. And I was like, oh, this is kind of a favorable matchup for Neil Magny. The younger the opponent, the better for Neil Magny. He's accustomed to fighting those young up-and-comers. But Mike Malott's 32 years old. He hasn't really had a test yet, so I understand why they're putting him against Neil Magny. But he beat a guy, Adam Fugit, in his last fight, Johan Linnes in the fight before that, Mickey Gall the fight before that. And basically, this is an attempt to build up a Canadian kind of prospect in a way. And Neil Magny's been the perennial top 15 kind of gatekeeper. And I think this is a prelim. I'm not dying to see this matchup. And this is another instance where I feel like the Canadian fans are kind of a victim of their own fighter's success because because the Canadian fans are so prideful of their, fighters from their region, the UFC's like, oh, we don't have to give them good fights. We can just give fighters who are from Canada, we'll put them on the main card. And they'll be like, oh, yes, we got a guy to cheer for. And that's kind of what's happening here. They're just booking Neil Magny versus Mike Mott as a featured fight on a pay-per-view main card in 2024. And considering Neil Magny got like 30-24 in his last fight against Ian Machado Gary, fight before that split decision against Phil Rowe, which, if I'm not mistaken, I thought Phil Rowe won that fight, but I don't remember for sure. Fight before that got dominated by Gilbert Burns, beat Daniel Rodriguez. So he's a guy that's been trading wins and losses. When's the last time he's at 1-2 fights in a row? We're looking back in 2020. At least Neil Magny's been kind of active because he's been just trading wins and losses and wins and losses. And actually, this was a grappling match. So he did win 2 fights in a row in 2021. Jeff Neal, which is a decent win, and Max Griffin. But that wasn't the same Jeff Neal. He was dealing with health issues. But I would have no problem if this was like a headliner of a prelims. That's really where this fight belongs. And this is just, this matchup is quintessential mediocre for a UFC pay-per-view. I just don't know how more I can describe it. I'm not looking forward to this fight either. Moving up on the card to the co-main event, a title fight that I cannot wait for. This is going to be such a banger. A title fight, 2 title fights in Canada. Oh my God, I can't wait for this. Thank you, MMA gods. Thank you, MMA gods. Oh, wait a second. What is it? Raquel Pennington versus Myra Bueno Silva for the vacant bantamweight title. Look, I'm not one of these fans that just hate on women's MMA. Raquel Pennington didn't even beat Ketlin Vieira, in my opinion. The fight before that, she beat Aspen Ladd. She hasn't looked good. I don't remember when Raquel Pennington has ever looked good in a fight ever, for the most part. She's not very good. The bantamweight division, the UFC hasn't invested in very much. And she's fighting Myra Bueno Silva, who's coming off a no contest against Holly Holm because she tested positive for some type of, I believe, ADHD drug, which we can have the debate whether or not it should have been overturned. But even beating Holly Holm, I get it, she went out there and finished her. But Holly Holm is kind of on the decline in her career. She's getting old. She's slowing down. She hasn't looked particularly good in the last few years. So for this to be a title fight, I'm not excited for it at all. I'm going to be honest. Like, I could literally skip this fight and I wouldn't care. And I'm not one of these these WMMA haters. I want to see Weili Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan. I want to see fights like that. But the bantamweight division took a massive loss when you lost Amanda Nunes. But to be quite honest, Amanda Nunes versus either one of these girls, I wouldn't be all that excited for either because I think Nunes blows both of them out of the water. So the division has lost a lot of its luster, which it never really even had, to be quite honest, because it was never super competitive at the top. And it just seems like the same fighters over the past 5-10 years just been recirculating in the women's bantamweight division. And this is a title fight that I don't care for at all. This should be on one of those cards that has 3 title fights, and it should be the 3rd title fight. I don't know if you find me one person that's excited for Raquel Pennington versus Myra Bueno Silva. You show me one person that's excited for Raquel Pennington versus Myra Bueno Silva, and I'll show you a liar. Because nobody's excited for this fight. Nobody cares about this fight. And this just goes to show how mediocre UFC 297 is. Think about those fights that I've broken down so far. None of them's good except Arnold Allen versus Movsar Evloev. That's the only good matchup on this card of the first 4 pay-per-view main card fights. And we're 3 weeks away, 3.5 weeks away, and they're not adding anything to this. They might shift it around. Maybe they put Chris Curtis, Marc-Andre Barriault on the main card. I think that was probably going to be the headline of the prelims. We don't know. They shuffle these cards around a lot. But this card is super mediocre. But let's move on to the bright spot of the card, which is Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis. I love this fight. I have no complaints. We have Sean Strickland, the middleweight champion, coming off a win against Israel Adesanya, an unexpected win against Israel Adesanya, versus the true #1 contender in Dricus Du Plessis. Round of applause for the UFC. What a change of pace when we're actually getting the true #1 contender fighting for the undisputed belt. That's crazy. We should do this more often. You have Dricus Du Plessis, undefeated in the UFC, coming off a nasty finish of Robert Whittaker where he absolutely melted him. Before that, stoppage wins over Derek Brunson and Darren Till. Win over Brad Tavares where he went to war. And Dricus Du Plessis has earned his spot as #1 contender. I was advocating for Dricus to get a title shot. A lot of people were advocating for Dricus to get a title shot. But for me, it's just the change of pace. When we've seen the UFC go the WWE route with Sean O'Malley versus Marlon Vera, with, you know, Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington and so on and so forth. We've seen them go the WWE route. I'm just happy to see them go, okay, Sean Strickland, the middleweight champion. Who's the number one contender? Oh, it's clearly Dricus Du Plessis, undefeated in the UFC. Beat Robert Whittaker in his last fight. He deserves the fight. He was promised a title shot. Let's book this matchup. And then on top of that, you have the newfound heat between Strickland and Du Plessis. So this main event, I have no complaints about it. I love the fight. And the back and forth between Strickland and Du Plessis, while it's a hair manufactured, I feel like it's actually real heat. I don't feel like this is like fake. I don't feel like Strickland's putting on for the cameras. I think Du Plessis is very clever in the way he attempts to promote fights. I believe the whole African comments that he made forever ago that people started to kind of blow out of proportion and, you know, picking one side or the other. I think Dricus knew exactly what he was doing there, and he was using that to promote a fight against Israel Adesanya. And now he went after Strickland and says, look, I'm going to beat you like your dad did when you were a child. And then Strickland gets all worked up, you know, and then they get in the altercation in the crowd with which the UFC definitely won it, and they're going to use that to promote the fight as well. You have heat on it, but forget about the drama for a second. Sean Strickland has been underrated for a while. I never expected him to become champion, but he's very technically sound everywhere. And, you know, he's gone out there and won 3 straight fights. He dethroned Israel Adesanya essentially on short notice, but then you have Dricus. I love the style clash in this main event because then you have Dricus, who's essentially just this bulldozer of physicality and heart and determination. And he doesn't look that good, but somehow he finds a way to get the job done. So you take all those factors together, and that makes this a banger main event. But the rest of the card, I just feel like they should have some better fights to complement this amazing main event, but they don't. It's just mediocre. But I hope this main event stays together. As long as the main event stays together, I'm still excited for UFC 297. But I'm sad for the Canadian fans. They deserve better than this. The same thing happened with UFC 289. There was really, that card turned out amazing in reality, but in terms of the relevance of the fights, it was Charles Oliveira versus Benil Dariush was the interesting fight on UFC 289. So I just feel like they deserve better quality, but at least they're getting a solid main event in Strickland versus Du Plessis. But overall, UFC 297 just completely mediocre, borderline horrible. And if someone falls out of the main event, even a replacement I don't think is going to be that good. I mean, what are we going to get, Strickland versus Cannonier 2? I don't want that unless Hamzat steps in or Adesanya steps in, which neither one of those are going to step in because UFC is not going to have them risk their star power on a short notice fight like they would for somebody like Strickland or Du Plessis. So if one of these guys fall out of the main event, I think this card is completely shot and borderline a fight night card. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you so much for watching.